Chapter 11: Waste and Pollution Management. This chapter requires the verified facility to have a good understanding of the wastes emanating from tea production and processing, while simultaneously minimizing the pollution through recycling and/or safe, responsible disposal systems. Verified units aspire to measure the amount of waste produced, reduce the amount of waste produced, reuse products where possible, recycle and properly dispose of all the remaining waste. Waste costs money, and the tea industry waste is no exception. Waste production, when no buyer can be found for the product, is the most obvious form of costly waste, but other forms of waste also represent missed opportunities. Proper waste disposal can also be costly, and it therefore makes sound business sense to use the waste hierarchy to reduce, reuse, and recycle waste wherever practical. Wastes often pose risks to people and the environment, especially if stored or disposed of thoughtlessly. Guidance for collection, storage, and disposal of specific wastes is covered in this document. Typical tea industry waste includes both non-hazardous and hazardous solid and liquid waste streams. Code Requirement 11.1, a mandatory criteria point. The verified facility shall have a waste management plan, including separation, reduction, and recycling of waste where possible. The factories, estates, housing colonies, and hospitals shall organize educational workshops for workers, residents of the garden, and smallholders to follow the waste management plan. The content of the training and the attendance of workers and smallholders shall be recorded. The intent: to ensure that a plan is adopted for the organization for handling and disposition of waste generated. It is expected that the organization's efforts are directed towards educating the personnel with respect to the aspects of waste management. The organization needs to ensure that there are adequate content material for waste management trainings, and records of such trainings imparted are also maintained. What you should do to meet the code requirement: 1. Identify, quantify, and classify the various types of waste that the organization generates. The organization's waste management plan should include: A. Factory effluents like spills of oil lubricants, diesel, paints, tea waste and wastewater. B. Chemical waste like PPF fertilizer bags, PPF containers, PPEs contaminated with chemicals. C. First aid, dispensary and hospital waste like anatomical waste, expired medicines, used needles, cotton swabs and others. D. Domestic waste like human sewage, everyday waste and others. E. Residual waste like treated wastewater. 3. A risk assessment is to be done and the outcome used to make the waste management plan and prioritize actions for managing waste. 4. The waste management plan should be based on minimizing risks of adverse effects from waste and minimizing the cost of waste. 5. Consent to operate conditions issued by Pollution Control Board is to be considered to manage factory effluents, Hazardous Waste Handling Rules 2008. For domestic waste, guidance from the nearby municipality can be taken. 6. Waste reduction, reuse and recycling options adopted for the particular type of waste and the reasons for not adopting any reduction, reuse or recycling options available are maintained. 7. Enumerate the goals and objectives. 8. Identify and train personnel responsible for segregation, handling and disposal of hazardous and non-hazardous waste from within the organization. 9. All the other workers in the organization should also be trained on waste and pollution. Awareness training on managing waste is to be organized for the residents of the garden and the smallholders too. 10. The trainer should have adequate knowledge on the subject. 11. Comprehensive records including the date, name of the trainer, topics covered, attendance of trainees, and contents of training provided should be all maintained. And 12. Reference of the manifest system to be maintained as per hazardous waste rules by maintaining Form 3 and periodic submission of Form 4. Records and documents to be maintained. Waste identification, quantification, and classification records, risk assessment for hazardous waste sites and action plans, waste management plan, consent to operate by PCB, effluent test report, training records, manifest records for identification, handling, storage and disposition of hazardous waste, submission of the statutory returns of hazardous waste. Code Requirement 11.2, a mandatory criteria point. The verified facility shall have a clear procedure for safe storage, handling and disposal of hazardous and non-hazardous waste. There should be clear and visible color coding, initial collection points for such wastes. The intent: to ensure that a procedure is adopted and practiced which deals with storage, handling and disposal of waste generated by the facility. The procedure also enumerates visual signages to be used for the waste during various stages. Process to meet the code requirement. 1. Organization to develop a procedure with respect to A. Waste segregation, B. Waste storage, C. Waste handling and D. Waste disposal. 2. Hazardous waste should be segregated from non-hazardous waste and clearly labeled. For example, different color-coded collection bins should be in place for the various types of waste in clinics and hospitals. 3. Adequate attention has to be given to safe storage. Refer 11.3. 4. There should be separate storage for different types of non-hazardous wastes, for example, plastics, glass, scrap metal and organic wastes. 5. Procedures should be clearly laid out to deal with handling and disposal of hazardous waste, such as CPP containers, materials contaminated with hazardous waste, used oils, medical waste, and some fertilizers, etc., as per the Hazardous Waste Handling Rules 2008. 6. Disposal of hazardous waste should be strictly as per Pollution Control Board guidelines or may be handed over to PCB approved registered recyclers. 7. Biomedical wastes are to be handled as per the current version of the Biomedical Waste Handling Rules. 8. Specific requirements pertaining to generation, labeling and disposition as specified within the hazardous waste rules need to be followed. Form 10. Records and documents to be maintained meticulously, procedure for segregation, safe storage, handling and disposal of hazardous and non-hazardous waste, color coding guidelines for various types of wastes, authorization from Pollution Control Board for handling of hazardous wastes, including the records related to biomedical wastes. Code 11.3, a mandatory criteria point. Hazardous waste shall be stored in locations where foreseeable events such as heavy rain or machinery breakdowns will prevent leakage or losses to the environment. The storage area shall not be accessible to unauthorized people. The intention: hazardous wastes are to be stored securely since it poses significant health, safety and environment risks. Process to meet the code requirement. 1. Storage of hazardous waste should be as per requirements of Hazardous Waste Handling Rules 2008. 2. The unit needs to demarcate areas for hazardous wastes which are suitably identified and stored. 3. Access to such stores is restricted. Signages are to be put up and people trained on the signages. 4. Hazardous waste stores must never be above or very close to domestic water supplies. 5. Stores are to be located well away from housing, offices, schools, food storage, surface water drains that lead directly into water courses. 6. Waste stores are to be contained and organized so that the contents do not spill or leak. 7. Empty CPP containers are to be triple rinsed and punctured before storage. 8. If hazardous waste is stored in significant quantity, it must be stored in areas with fire protection. 9. The unit is to keep up-to-date records of location and content of hazardous waste sites. 10. An evaluation needs to be done with respect to the probability of impact on environment through leakage and loss in case of heavy rains, machine failures and other natural calamities. Records and documents. Records of location and content of hazardous waste sites. Records for amount of waste stored and disposed. Code Requirement 11.4, a mandatory criteria point. The verified facility shall be aware of and demonstrate compliance with national legal obligations with respect to energy use related emissions, fuel use, electrical power, and fuel burning installations. The intention is to ensure that the units are compliant with legal requirements related to energy use related emission, fuel use, electrical power, and fuel burning installations. Process to meet the code requirement. 1. All emissions to the air must comply with the requirements of Air Act 1981. 2. Consent to operate needs to be sought from the Pollution Control Board under the Air Act 1981, which includes the limit and the conditions to comply. 3. Training sessions should be conducted for people handling legal compliance. 4. All evidences of legal compliances, emissions, to be maintained by the unit, along with clearly assigned responsibilities for emission management and compliance. Records and documents to be maintained meticulously. Register of relevant laws and regulations. Consent to operate under Air Act. Training records. Code Requirement 11.5. The verified facility should have a plan to monitor energy use and demonstrate that this plan is used to incrementally improve energy efficiency and reduce emissions where practical. The intent: to ensure that the unit has a plan in place to improve energy efficiency and reduce emissions. Process to meet the code requirement. 1. Energy consumption, energy use related emissions, fuel use, electrical power, and fuel burning installations is to be recorded. 2. When considering energy use, all usages in a state, factories, as well as domestic use needs to be considered. 3. In case of fuel burning installations and installations, heat transfer areas, combustion controls, type of fuel used are to be checked and recorded. 4. A documented energy management plan is to be formulated to reduce energy consumption. 5. Responsibility is to be clearly assigned to improve energy efficiency. 6. Energy saving objectives and targets to be adopted. 7. Energy audits may be conducted to identify areas of improvement and also where efficiency can be improved. 8. Irrigation pumps, machineries are to be tested and calibrated periodically to optimize energy use. 9. New energy technologies and alternative or renewable sources of energy might be considered as far as practically possible. 10. Provide training to personnel on the various options, technology available to reduce energy use and reduce emission. Records and documents to be maintained. Energy use records, energy management plan, energy audit report, data showing improvement in efficiency and reduction of emission. Code Requirement 11.6, a mandatory criteria point. Handling of wastes that require burning shall be done through the methods approved by the State Pollution Control Board only. The intent: to ensure that wastes which are required to be incinerated should be done as per approved mechanism given by the Pollution Control Board, or any method adopted by the unit should be approved by Pollution Control Board prior to execution. Process to meet the code requirement. 1. The unit is required to collect and dispose of their waste at specific disposal sites, and such collection and disposal is required to be monitored by the concerned Pollution Control Board. 2. Open burning of waste is prohibited. 3. Hazardous waste has to be handled as per hazardous and other wastes management and transboundary movement rules 2016. Any specific guidelines in the Pollution Control Board consent will also apply. Records and documents to be maintained meticulously. Records of incineration, disposal of hazardous or non-hazardous wastes. Code Requirement 11.7, a mandatory criteria point. Plastic items, PVC and other toxic items shall never be burnt and shall be disposed of as per government regulations. The intent: to ensure that plastic, PVC and toxic items are not burned but treated as per guidelines given in the government's rules and regulations. Process to meet the code requirement. 1. plastics and PVC waste generated by the unit needs to be given to recyclers or vendors who have supplied materials in plastic or PVC containers. Such items should not be burnt in the open or in incinerators. Plastics and PVC waste needs to be stored in designated areas in case there are no recyclers available. 2. Chemical containers after use can be sold back to the manufacturer under a buyback scheme. 3. Toxic waste can only be handed to authorized agencies as specified by PCB as per Hazardous Waste Management and Handling Rules 2008. In case toxic waste is to be stored within the premises, it should be duly approved by State Pollution Control Board. 4. Best practices for plastic waste management can be adopted from the Ministry of Environment and Forest guidelines by logging on to their website given below. Records and documents to be maintained meticulously. Records of plastic wastes recycled or given back to manufacturer. Approvals from authorities SPCB to handle toxic waste. Code Requirement 11.8. The landfills and dumps within the verified facility shall be as per the State Pollution Control Board guidelines and have such design that minimizes risk of environmental contamination and damage to human health. The intention is to ensure that all landfill and dumps are designed to take care of the environmental impacts and damage to human health. Such landfills should be approved by the PCB. Process to meet the code requirement. 1. Design landfill and dumps as per the environmental aspect, impact, as well as health and safety risk evaluation. Approval of the landfill design from concerned PCB. 2. Landfill sites should be away from habitation clusters, water bodies, wetlands, and other vulnerable habitats. 3. Landfill sites should be clearly marked and fenced to restrict access by unauthorized people and prevent entry of animals. Landfills used for disposal are to be constructed using an impermeable liner. 4. Sanitary landfills should be as per guidelines mentioned in the Municipal Solid Waste Management as a best practice. 5. For small amounts of waste, for example, mobile toilets, if disposal cannot be arranged via specialized contractors, burial is usually a good solution, with the site being chosen carefully. 6. Keep records of the location and quantities of waste deposited in the various sites, farm, landfill and/or discharge to drains, sewers, surface water, land or groundwater, including cesspits, soakaways, septic tanks and pit latrines. 7. Proper drainage to be provided to divert runoff water to treatment area from the active landfill site. Records and documents to be maintained. Design documents of landfill sites. Approval of PCB for the landfill sites, records of amounts and location of waste landfilled.